Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And today, my friend Joe Balkoski returns to the channel to share the story of the 29th Division in Brittany, and particularly the Brest campaign. It's a campaign I think is overlooked by many, but the battles for this area were tough. And Joe's books on the subject are, of course, in the description below. And this is part of a series of Brittany shows where Ronan is joining us tomorrow, a French historian, talk in more detail about the fortifications. We've got a 2nd Division one coming later, and an 83rd Division one. But Joe is the 29th Division go-to person. So good afternoon, Joe. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Paul. Wonderful to be on yet again.
Yet again. So we were just chatting before going online. It's that sort of transition because, you know, we define the Normandy campaign, the Brittany campaign, the Rhine campaign, etc., etc. But actually, for some of the troops involved, it's more sort of transitional. I mean, I'm assuming that if you're a member of the 29th Division, you don't really feel that the Normandy campaign has a complete distinct end and the Brittany campaign picks up as a separate one. It's a sort of just a kind of a same day, different place. Is that kind of how it works?
To some extent. The 29th Division had the good fortune of being pinched out of the Falaise pocket a couple of days before the denouement, so to speak. So they had a couple of days break, much needed because the casualties, the post-Saint Malo August 1st to August 15th period were very, very brutal. But you are right that the break was short and not enough for the men, obviously. And by August 21st, they found themselves in hundreds and hundreds of deuce-and-a-half trucks on their way to Brittany. And literally within 2 days of embarking in the Veer area, they were engaged against the Germans in the Brest defenses. So it was, and as you well know, Paul, interestingly enough, the terrain in the western area of Brittany, unfortunately for the 29ers, had a remarkable similarity to Normandy. It's another area of France where you find the unique hedgerows, and that was a bit of a shock to the men. They thought they had seen the last of that, and unfortunately they hadn't. So
yeah. So we haven't talked yet about what the Allies were originally thinking about for Brittany, because clearly looking at that map there, it's not the right direction to push the Germans back to Germany. It's going the other way. It's going west. So, you know, we talked last week about the Allies' reluctance to go towards Paris. So ahead of June the 6th, you know, back in the overlord planning, what were the Allies thinking about in terms of Brittany? Obviously, they're completely aware of the massive, great U-boat pens and the bases there. But what's the theory in advance of June the 6th?
That's a great question because it's one of the most overlooked aspects of the Northwest Europe campaign. Brittany was a pivotal element of Operation Overlord, as conceived even in 43 by General Morgan. And to state the obvious, most of your listeners understand this, it was primarily aimed as a logistical base for the Allies, because of course in World War I, Brittany and particularly Brest was the main entry point into Europe for the American Expeditionary Force. And General Marshall, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, really hoped to replicate that again in World War II. So, you know, Eisenhower is reputed to have made this quote. I'm not sure he really did. Maybe you would know, Paul. The statement that good generals study strategy, great generals study logistics. Not sure Ike really said that, but
I think it's attributed to a lot of people, isn't it? But I think it's one of those mantras that various people have kind of adopted. I think Napoleon is said to him as well, but it makes a lot of sense.
Right. So, I mean, well, why did Overlord depend so heavily on the liberation of Brittany? Because if you look at this map, you know, we ultimately were going to have to supply 2 million Americans, and obviously the Commonwealth forces, huge numbers had to be supplied as well. But if you look at the logistical situation, upon kicking in the door on D-Day, and we all have had talks about Mulberry, we've had talks about the liberation of Cherbourg, that was obviously not enough.
Yeah.
The big five harbors of Northwest Europe that Overlord was depending on ultimately were Brest, Cherbourg, Le Havre, Antwerp, and ultimately Marseille with Operation Dragoon, which we can discount for the sake of this hour. But, really among those five, Antwerp was the most important, but it was also by far the most distant from Normandy, and the expectation of capturing it was really far in the future. And ultimately, of course, it was captured much earlier than expected. So what I'm trying to say is Brest was really the number one major harbor that was expected to supply at least the American logistical effort in Northwest Europe, as I said, as it did in World War I. Brest, I believe, is the second biggest harbor in France next to Marseille. Some of your listeners may correct me on that, but I'm pretty sure that's true. So General Bradley was responsible for fulfilling that element of Operation Overlord and clearing Brest. And we will talk at the end of this hour about why it was very controversial what Bradley did in Brest, because, as you know, ultimately Brest was never used, despite the loss of nearly 10,000 men in its liberation. So if we cut to the chase and say August 20th, 1944, the Falaise pocket has been closed. Bradley, who had experience, of course, in the liberation of Cherbourg, he committed three very good infantry divisions to its liberation, the 4th, the 9th, and the 79th. And even then, it was a tough fight. Given the importance of Brest and the speed with which the Americans wanted to get it open, he followed the same planning process in terms of liberating Brest. He committed the our 29th Division, the 2nd Division, and the 8th Division, which to some seemed a bit like overkill. As it turned out, it wasn't even enough. The lessons were there, Paul. Saint Malo, which fell in early August, was liberated by one U.S. Army division, the 83rd, and that was an amazingly tough fight. And I guess we'll have a talk about that this week. So Bradley, knowing the significance General Marshall put on the clearance of Brittany, really wanted to get the job done quickly, and so he committed an entire corps of 3 divisions plus a very large amount of corps level troops. And this map shows the route that the 29th Infantry Division took to travel from the Colline de Normandy, the area near Vire, to get to Brest. And they left mid-morning on August 21st, 44, and they arrived in the environs of Brest on the 23rd, only 2 days. And, it's a 200 mile, well, not quite 200 miles, it's about 170 miles. And they were engaged in combat on the day they arrived at Brest. So we can touch on a couple of quick things before. I'm not going to get into the tactical nature of the battle. Your listeners, if they want to learn about that, you can read my book on it, or I'm sure maybe this week some of your people on the show will be talking about that. I'm really going to be talking about the combat lessons of what the 29th Division learned in the Brittany campaign, and what a surprise the whole thing was.
And what state were they in? Because we've talked with you about the build up to D-Day. We've looked at with other historians about the cost of the Normandy campaign in terms of leadership, because you're losing platoon commanders, you're losing experienced non-coms. Officers who are surviving are being promoted and taking over their own units. So in August 21st, 22nd, what sort of state of the 29th Division? Is there still a clear, distinct connection to that kind of 1943 training period with familiar faces and names, or are there a lot of new faces that they're trying to phase in? I guess both.
That's a great question. The division, to be blunt, was a very badly beat up outfit. Realistically, it shouldn't have been committed to a major operation as it was. It was pinched out of the line at Falaise on the 15th. So realistically, it had about 2 months plus a week of intense combat in Normandy, and the division lost 9,000 men in that period. It's unthinkable, that level of loss, especially when one ponders the fact that at any given time, the 14,000 men of the 29th Division, really, the division only had about 5,200 infantrymen. And those 5,200 infantrymen had turned over, some say, twice by the time the division departed from Normandy. So it's a great question, Paul, and I'll touch on this in a moment. The division really, it was a big question mark as to whether the 29th Division, and I suppose other divisions that I'm not as well informed about, were ready to go into the intense level of combat against fixed fortifications that they were about to do. And I'll talk about that in a moment. In fact, as an introduction to this whole subject of the 29th Division moving into Brittany, the division was challenged in so many ways, and how they met that challenge, we will talk about, but it also was a microcosm of how every other division in the U.S. Army met the challenges of this period. The first one is what we just talked about. Could a division that lost 9,000 men in 2 months continue to engage in combat simply by having thousands of replacements infused in there without any particular training? We'll discuss that soon. Second issue, look at that map on the screen right now. That was a 170-mile journey. Of course, your listeners know that U.S. Army in World War II was not a mechanized army. Only 20 of the 90 divisions raised by the Americans for World War II were truly motorized. Any U.S. Army infantry division had been trained, generally where they had to go, they had to walk. Now, of course, with the breakout in Operation Cobra, the Army had to extemporize. And one of the ways they did it was, this brilliant challenge of how do we get people to go hundreds of miles when they don't have the vehicles to do it? Well, I'll give you how the 29th Division did it. It took the attachment of 6 quartermaster truck companies from corps level units, and each quartermaster truck company had 50 trucks. Each truck carried 25 men. So if you do the math, 2 truck companies could carry a regiment, and 6 truck companies could carry all 3 regiments. The rest of the division, artillery, engineers, pretty much had enough vehicles to move on their own. So it was, quite a, I think, indicative of the maturation of the U.S. Army, that on a moment's notice, you could have a immobile infantry division move 170 miles in less than 2 days, immediately engage in combat, and then have the trucks go off and do the things that they were supposed to do. It was really indicative of the fact that the Army had really begun to learn what this campaign across France was going to be like. So that's one thing. As I said, we'll talk a little bit in a moment about the challenge of using a division that is almost essentially new to fight against a very, very determined enemy. Because in the Brittany campaign, it was a massive U.S. Army intelligence failure. The 29th and, well, I should say 8th Corps, of which the 29th Division was a member, along with the 2nd Division and the 8th Division, commanded by General Troy Middleton, really a, underrated leader, former commander of the 45th Infantry Division, kind of took heat for what happened in the Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah.
But, really, from what I understand and how he ran the Brittany campaign, a real soldier. But anyway, Middleton was told that there would be 10 to 15,000 men defending Brest. Not only did it turn out that the actual number was over 40,000, but among those defenders, much to the shock of the 29ers as they, detrucked and started to engage combat, was the 2nd Fallschirmjäger, or parachute division, led by the notorious Romke. There he is, great picture. We'll try to talk a little bit about him, or if anybody has questions, we could talk.
I mean, just to intercede that. I mean, I think we all of us have this idea that German units along the coast are by nature the crap ones, because that's our perception for D-Day. That it's the mobile tank divisions, it's the SS, the Waffen SS that are where the decent Germans are. And when we think of even ports, like, I mean, Cherbourg, for example, the Germans defending Cherbourg were all right, but there was nothing special there. Le Havre later in the war, but as you're saying there, Brest ends up being defended by not only very, very capable troops, but as you say, their commanding officer, who is he's out to make a name for himself and also be pretty ruthless in his defense. I mean, he's not going to do a Coltitz in Paris and sort of sacrifice, surrender the city. He's going to go down fighting, isn't he?
Absolutely, and so much so that he was jailed for war crimes after World War II, I believe, for 6 years. The French resistance really wanted to get him. And I think it was only due to the intervention of the British and the Americans that he was spared a death penalty, to tell the truth. But so imagine the shock of the 29th Division when they're told they were going to have 10,000 second-rate garrison troops defending Brest, and the moment they attack a hedgerow in the outer defense lines of Brest, as you can see on this map, the first troops they encounter are Fallschirmjäger.
Yeah.
The young Aryan 19-year-olds armed with you would know more than me about this, Paul, supposedly the best armed German troops in Europe, but I'm not sure that really was true. But nevertheless, men who worshiped Romke and men who were willing to, fight to the end, and they did. So the last thing I want to mention about the challenge that the 29th Division would face, again, a microcosm of the U.S. Army as a whole, as this in the post-Normandy period, is supply. The whole Brittany campaign was one logistical mess.
Yep.
And much to his credit, Troy Middleton, the Corps commander, bitched and moaned from day one. He said, you gave me 3 divisions. You underestimated the number of Germans in this city. They're entrenched in very, very solid fortifications, and you're not giving me any supplies. You know who was Troy Middleton's boss at this time? It was George Patton. And George Patton really did a number on Middleton. He did not grant even remotely the supplies that Middleton would need to seize Brest. And it was almost a little bit of a conspiracy, because Patton obviously had his focus on other areas of the world. Your listeners know that. And to Patton, Brest was a backwater, and he did not acknowledge, really, much to his detriment, that the grand view of Marshall, that if Brest was to be seized in a lightning stroke, and it almost was, if Brest was to be seized and opened up as an entry port for Americans straight from the States, it was going to be a huge logistical advantage. And the person who really messed that up from day one was George Patton.
Yep.
Third Army logistical officers were quoted as saying Middleton's logistical requirements were, quote unquote, hysterical. Middleton said, I can't do the job. He threatened to resign. Bradley, to his credit, he immediately said, okay, you don't have to answer to Patton anymore. You have to answer to General Lee at Communication Zone. Even that was a logistical mess. So the 29th Division, as so many American divisions were going to have to do in the fall, all across the board, had to fight with one hand tied behind its back. And
this is indicative of this period of the war, though, isn't it? I mean, I'm not defending Patton or criticizing him per particularly. But Dragoon has commenced on August the 15th. There's the break on for Paris right now as we're talking about this, or this action in Brittany. The Allies are beginning to realize that they haven't got enough supplies for everything. They're trying to push on all these different campaigns, and the armor divisions we talked about with Don Fox a few weeks ago, pushing on at the same time. They're burning through the fuel, they're burning through the ammunition, so there isn't really enough to go around. And as you say there, this plan for Brittany, it's not like this is the improvised one. This is the one they planned in advance. In the actual argument is that everything Patton is doing is the improvised stuff. This is where it arguably should be going, because it was the original plan.
Exactly. This was the original plan. And at the end, toward the end of this talk, we will discuss how historians have ripped into the Brittany campaign as being useless. And I really fight against that theory in my book, because when you examine the campaign on a day-to-day basis, there's no notion anywhere among the high command that it was useless. It only was viewed as useless way after the event.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about that.
Yeah. And just before we move on, in terms, obviously, the same thing applies to air support as well. The air support of which the Allies have, more or less supremacy in this part of the ETO. But again, they're covering a huge amount of territory with it. So, and tank divisions aren't going into Brittany. So it's kind of infantry and not much air cover. Is that kind of a good summary?
To some extent, although that's a great intro to what I'll talk about right now. How the 29th Division coped with this, one can only state, logistical emergency.
Yep.
It was a very pioneering effort in how the rest of the army was going to try to do the same things, as you pointed out later on. And one of the ways they did it was with air power. When every artillery battalion in the 29th Division was down to orders of not firing more than 1/3 of its daily allotment of ammunition every day. And believe me, against the fortifications of Brest, 1/3 of your daily allotment of shells is not enough. One of the ways they compensated was through tactical air power. And there's no question that this campaign, because Bradley recognized how dire the artillery ammunition shortage was, he committed a vast amount of 9th Air Force tactical air power to make up for that in Brittany. And the results of that are an absolute watershed in the U.S. Army. I'm surprised that more authors don't talk about this, because Paul, the tactical air power, at least for the American Army, I'm not sure about the British Canadian armies, in Normandy was abysmal. General Gerhardt, commander of the 29th, often said, we don't even ask for it, because by the time we get it, it's useless. And the really smart whiz kids in both the ground and air components that went into Brittany established the pattern that would later become the norm for the rest of the army. It was called the quote-unquote air alert system. And it was really superb. It changed the way tactical air power worked for the rest of the war for the U.S. Army. The fundamental basis of it was that you put an experienced fighter bomber pilot in division headquarters, and you gave him authority over 2 operations officers in the 29th who would tell this pilot where the air power was most needed and what the enemy was doing at that point. And this pilot would have more or less continuous contact with a flight of either Mustangs or Thunderbolts or Lightnings that were flying more or less continuously in flights of 4 over the front. And I won't get into the complexities, but the bottom line, as Gerhardt pointed out in his after-action report, is we could have bombs falling within 500 yards of a frontline position within 30 minutes of asking for it. And, Paul, that was just completely impossible for the Americans in Normandy. It changed everything. And, that was one of the ways that the 29th at least contributed to this pioneering new method. They did other things, the use of tank destroyers as mobile artillery, because tank destroyers, their ammunition supply followed a different administrative path. Chemical mortars, the 4.2-inch mortar ended up being pretty much substitute artillery throughout the Brittany campaign. But anyway, that's a great question. And I should also point out that on the opposite side of the coin, the use of heavy air power, as was almost always the case, you correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, but the use of heavy air power in Brittany was overwhelmingly useless.
I pretty much agree with that. Yeah.
Brest was pounded into rubble by heavy American and British bombers, almost more than any city in Western Europe. And, the primary target being the submarine pens. And I've been in those submarine pens, Paul. They were impervious. And, it was a wasted effort. And it had almost no applicable benefit to the ground troops. And can you name any effort that was done by heavy air power after this? I don't think so.
No, I can't think of one. No, someone in the audience might know. And just a question just came up, I think is worth addressing, because they're talking about the American supply issues and logistics issues. And Peter O'Connell asked, what was the supply situation of the German defenders? Could they be resupplied at all? Well, I'm going to go out and say I don't think they could be resupplied, but they had massives of stocks, didn't they? I mean, the U-boat bases, the fortifications that we're talking about Brest had been building up an arsenal for years. So I'm assuming they've got reasonable amount of everything.
Yes, I mean, I'm not an expert on that, but you hit the nail on the head. They had fair warning when the Normandy front looked like it was going to crack to be able to gather everything in Western Brittany into Brest, because obviously they understood what the importance of Brest to the Allies as well. And no, there was no practical means of resupplying the Germans. I mean, occasional submarines would be going in and out during the siege of Brest, but obviously insignificant.
Yeah.
German seaplanes were flying in and out of Brest during the campaign. In fact, right at the end, one of them tried to come in on September 19th, the day after the surrender of the city, to try to pick up Romke and get him back to Germany. But the seaplane faced too much anti-aircraft fire and had to turn back. But no, there was no real means of resupply, but there was also no evidence that the Germans ever ran out of anything.
Yeah, so I was going to say that they've got masses of defenses there. So we're looking at the map there where we are at the end of August and the situation. So let's kind of talk about that push in down towards Brest and what the 29ers are up against.
Well, I think the first thing that we have to talk about is, despite the 170-mile truck drive and a little bit at the close of the Normandy campaign of a somewhat of a mobile campaign as the Falaise Gap was closing, the 29th was, of course, in for a shock. This was going to be stagnant warfare. I mean, as you can see from this map, there were no means of flanking maneuvers or parachute drops or amphibious landings. This was just a go-ahead, hedgerow by hedgerow, day by day slugfest, and that's what it turned out to be. However, I'm going to point out this unique factor that I think might have been unique in the U.S. Army in Europe in World War II. The 29th Division, which held the westernmost of this triangle around Brest, or I should say maybe half circle around Brest, actually had to fight with its main body facing due east toward the city and a minor body facing due west toward the Logistical Peninsula. So it actually was fighting in two directions at once, which was unique. If you look at this map in the lower left-hand corner, you see the Logistical Peninsula, and that was the location from where the Germans put much of their heavy artillery and coastal defenses in the event of an Allied amphibious assault. And again, some of your listeners may know more than me, but I believe the so-called Graf Spee battery, which was right smack in the middle of Le Conquet, had the largest naval guns in all of the Atlantic Wall. They were 11-inch guns. I don't know if there were 11-inch guns in Normandy. Would you know that?
No, not in Normandy. I don't think so. No, Calais probably, but yeah. No, I think you're right. I think that they're certainly amongst the biggest, if not the biggest. Yeah.
So this position was not only meant to be a strong point, a strong point that stood on its own, but it had tremendous firepower. And believe it or not, those 11-inch guns of the Graf Spee battery had 360-degree rotation. And believe it or not, they could turn toward Brest and fire right into the rear of the American lines that were moving east to capture the city. So General Gerhardt had to carry on two campaigns simultaneously, capturing the coastal positions on Finisterre and Le Conquet, and then also driving into the city. And of course, much of that campaign was undertaken by Rangers. Rudder's 2nd Ranger Battalion and Sullivan's 5th Ranger Battalion of D-Day fame end up, doing very sterling service in Le Conquet. If we have time, I'll talk about the story of Lieutenant Edlin, another D-Day hero who ends up almost single-handedly capturing the observation mound for the Graf Spee battery. Amazing story. But so anyway, that is the tactical situation. A real dilemma in that you have to fight just a slugfest eastward to capture the city, and then deal with German artillery firing into your rear. Let's go back a little bit to what I talked about 5 or 10 minutes ago. Unless you guys have questions, are there any questions you want to pile
There
on?
are some I'll throw to you later, but they're not there for the end rather than now. We're back to you at the moment.
Okay. So I mentioned to you that realistically, the 29th Division needed much, much more time to infuse replacements and recover the spirit that it had had in the early phases of the Normandy campaign. The addition of replacements in the rifle squads and the rifle platoons was just almost 100%. And again, for all that we can say about General Gerhardt, and some of your listeners may not know about him, you either love him or you hate him, and there are probably more reasons to hate him than to love him. There's a great, great drawing of him. And as somebody who's written about him now for over 30 years, I don't know what to think about him, but I can tell you he had some very deplorable characteristics, and what I'm about to tell you now, he had some very positive characteristics. Again, Gerhardt was one of the rare pioneering two-star, division level and corps level generals in the U.S. Army who was willing to recognize that the U.S. Army replacement system, as envisioned by Marshall, that is that we wanted U.S. divisions just to be in the line continuously, and no matter what losses they had, they could be replaced, and you could leave them putting pressure on the Germans despite the losses by just pumping new men in. In theory, that was the way it was supposed to work, but as we know, in reality, it didn't really work well. But Gerhardt was one of the earliest to recognize that, and interestingly enough, he was deeply influenced, of all things, by a second lieutenant. There was a second lieutenant who I knew named Dwight Gentry. He was, believe it or not, he was the only officer left in Company I of the 115th Infantry in the post-Saint Malo period before the capture of Vire. Only officer in the company. I think the company was down to only 80 or 90 men out of the 200 it was supposed to have. And of the 80, most of them were replacements. And Gentry, being a mere second lieutenant, didn't have much pull. Anyway, he watched a squad during the Vire offensive walk unwisely right into an open field, surrounded by the typical Norman hedgerows, and he watched the entire squad be cut down by a single machine gun. All the men were killed. And he became so frustrated that he told me this story on the telephone. He grabbed a paper bag and a pen, and on the bag he said, "We need in this division a means of putting replacements in a rear area training facility before you put them into our rifle companies." He said, "Because they're just getting killed. We're having squad leaders who are supposedly staff sergeants who don't know any more than the privates, and who themselves were privates a week ago." And believe it or not, he gave this to a courier, and it was delivered to General Gerhardt, and Gerhardt actually went with it. He said, "Gentry, great idea. We are now going to establish a method in the 29th Division where replacements are never to be forwarded from a depot directly into a unit that is in the line, that is verboten. We now must have a period where they are only attached to a company when they're in the rear echelon, and they have at least 3 days to meet their comrades, to practice tactics before going into the front." And from that idea emerged a truly innovative concept, which was the 29th Infantry Division Training Center, which was more or less a tactical rear echelon camp that the 29th Division run by a field grade officer who did nothing but train replacements before they were sent to the front. And this is what was happening in Brittany, and it paid tremendous dividends. We didn't have any of those tragic incidents that we had in Normandy of a young replacement kid coming up under the cover of darkness, being put into a frontline foxhole at night, and then his body is being taken out dead the next morning. And Gerhardt mercifully addressed that question, and he did it well. And for the rest of the war, that concept worked well. And a lot of other divisions started doing that as well. As to who they were, I'm not entirely sure, but it was a pioneering effort by the 29th. And it is one of the reasons why the division was able to quickly reassert, the high morale that it had on D-Day. And believe me, the fighting against the Fallschirmjäger was not easy.
It's almost the same kind of mentality that the airborne divisions and commander units and elite units had, because they tend to be better at integrating people in and bringing them up to speed than perhaps your regular line infantry. The 29th kind of, as you said, they're kind of innovative in this area of how to deal with that constant turnover of personnel and bring them up to speed. It would all be the way the current military works, but yeah, no, I'm with you though. Gerhardt is an interesting figure. The more I read about him, the less I really make up my mind about him. He just very confusing.
Well, if I have time, and maybe now is the time, the negative elements of Gerhardt also at this same time come out in a big way, Paul. What the hell? I'll talk about it now.
Yeah, let's go for it.
At the close of the Brest campaign, as your listeners all know, Brest was a major German U-boat base, and you've heard the stories about when German U-boat crews came back from lengthy cruises, the merriment they would have, and of course the stories that there were houses of prostitution, and I'm sure people know exactly where they were. But when the liberation was finally about to happen, General Gerhardt, and we have complete evidence of this because we have the transcript of him saying it on the War Room Journal, he said that when the Germans surrender, we are going to open up the old German houses of prostitution. I will spare your listeners the more coarse language he used, but he did. And the stories of that house of prostitution have been greatly exaggerated over time. But to cut to the chase, Let's see, 2 months later, when the division is in Western Germany near Jülich, a colonel from the Ninth Army who is an inspector general, and you know, in the U.S. Army, the inspector general is, you know, anybody who's working for the inspector general is sacred. No matter what rank he is, you cannot stop that guy from asking questions. And Gerhardt made the big mistake of saying to this guy, "You're a colonel. I don't want you in my headquarters. I don't care what you want." And it turns out that he was sent directly by General Simpson of Ninth Army, because Simpson had been contacted by Omar Bradley saying that a Catholic charity organization in the United States had found out, due to 29th Division chaplains, that a house of prostitution had been opened up for the 29th Division soldiers at Brest. And General Bradley was as blunt as he could be. He said, "I would like this investigated as soon as possible." And I'll tell you what, that investigation was not pretty. And we'll leave what happened to Gerhardt for a later show.
It's one of those ones. I've had that conversation with some of the veterans about Gerhardt and the situation with the houses of ill repute in Brest, and it's lots of legends are told within the unit, which is interesting. But yeah, thank you for sharing that side story there. Classic World War II TV rabbit hole that was.
So, I mean, you know, my sense is that General Gerhardt did you might even say a superb job readying the division for what it had to do, because, you know, let's discuss what the tactical task was here. If you look at this map, you see that Römke was very smart. He extended the defenses of Brest well outward in that semicircle. So every hedgerow that the 29th, 8th, and 2nd captured really only was a couple of hundred yards closer to the final objective. And what was assumed by General Bradley was a campaign that would last a week or 10 days, as was the case with Cherbourg, as you pointed out. But ultimately, this was a 25-day campaign of more or less continuous action that was only tempered by the fact that the Americans had to occasionally stop because they ran out of ammunition and you know, just didn't have the supplies to keep going. So a 25-day campaign, and the closer that exterior line was pushed inward toward the city, the tougher the German defenses became. And I think tomorrow you're going to have Renan on, and he'll be talking about the fortifications, and because they play an absolute pivotal role. I mean, ironically, you find 29th Division soldiers attacking 17th century fortifications. And it's really among the toughest fighting that the division ever does in World War II. And it's also where inter-allied cooperation, I won't talk too much about this, but the contribution of a very small squadron of British Army Crocodile tanks ends up playing an absolutely pivotal role in overcoming some of those fixed fortifications. I mean, it must have been a very, very odd feeling for a British Army squadron of maybe 100 guys in a sea of 90,000 Americans, you know, and they literally were the only British servicemen there. And their service was absolutely exemplary. One of the tankers received a Silver Star from General Gerhardt, which is, believe it or not, I mean, for a 29er to receive a Silver Star was very, very difficult in this division. For a British Army soldier to get one, only time in World War II that ever happened. But anyway, the fixed fortifications, which I guess will be tomorrow, very, very interesting story of the Siege of Brest. So to cut, how much, we have about 15 minutes.
Oh, keep going. We can do a bit longer. Everyone's enjoying it. I'm enjoying it.
Okay. Maybe we should start to talk about the elephant in the room. And that is the close of the campaign and what happened afterwards. So the 29th and the other divisions essentially began the submission of Brest on the 23rd of August. It wasn't until the 18th of August that the city was liberated, but as many of your listeners probably know, Romke escaped over the bay to a remote position, and he wasn't captured until the 19th. And he was captured, interestingly enough, by the former colonel of the 116th Infantry on D-Day, Charles Canham, who had now risen to one-star rank and was assistant division commander of the 8th Division. And he accepted the surrender from Romke, much to Romke's displeasure, because Romke felt that Canham did not have sufficient rank. You know, the Germans were crazy in that department. They didn't like it if an inferior officer was the one taking the surrender. And you probably know that story of Romke looking at Canham, who was rather scruffy to begin with, and he said, you know, where are your credentials? And at this famous story, Canham waved to the dirty infantryman, and he said, these are my credentials. And, you know, that actually became a U.S. Army motto in the 90s. Although I will tell you that I read Romke's account of that meeting, and it's completely different than Canham's account. Completely different. Romke claims that he got Canham drunk on Cointreau, and he called Canham a nitwit. That was the word that was translated. And he said that he got him drunk on this hard liqueur, and while he was getting him drunk, all of Romke's clerks were destroying all the secret messages and everything. Romke was a compulsive liar, so you don't really know whether that story is bull or not. But anyway, so Romke is taken prisoner, and within 24 hours, he is flown to Britain. And you probably know this, Paul, but you know, in British prisoner of war camps for general officers, they put recording devices in the rooms.
Yep. Yeah.
Have you heard about that?
Yeah, we've did it. Helen Fry, British historian, did a fantastic book about it, and we had her on the channel talking about it a couple of years ago. Yeah, extraordinary stuff. And he was one of those ones who said a lot, didn't he?
Oh my God!
He didn't stop. I mean, he just
Exactly right. I was very, very lucky to have gotten those transcripts, and Romke really was a nutcase. You know, he was blathering on to the fellow generals. Nobody else was getting to talk. And it was very evident. I think Fritz Bayerlin of Africa Corps fame was in there. I'm pretty sure. I may be wrong.
I think he was. Yeah.
And he just despised Romke. He thought Romke was, an uneducated fool. But anyway, in those transcripts, Romke boasts, I guess somewhat to his credit, about how he completely wrecked the harbor. And he did more than just demolish port facilities. He supposedly was putting like chemicals in the water, and there was when the U.S. Navy came in to examine the port, there was a stink that went, that didn't go away for months. Anyway, Romke, we learn a lot about him from those transcripts, and he certainly was not. He was obviously a braggart. One thing I didn't mention early part of the show is that Romke came extremely close to being killed by the French resistance. I don't know if you heard that story, but his chief of staff in the 2nd Fallschirmjäger Division, early August, they were driving into Brest to start arranging the defenses, and a French resistance ambush opened up on the car and killed the chief of staff sitting right next to him. And Romke, obviously shocked, but he had many, many reprisals. And that's why the French really wanted to get him for that. And I don't know the details of that. Maybe some of your listeners would. But he was, I believe he was, as I said, had a death penalty, but it was, he was released by 1951, I think. So let's talk about why there is a controversy about the Brest campaign. Because in retrospect, 29th Division lost about 3,000 men, comparable numbers for the other two divisions and corps level troops, about 10,000 casualties to take the city. But by roughly September 30th, October 1st, 1944, the decision was made to not do anything to restore Brest, and not an Allied ship would dock there for the rest of World War II. So, post-war historians, and I mean really post-war, like 70s, 80s, really started to do that. Are British listeners familiar with the term Monday morning quarterbacking?
Yeah, we know. Yep. Yeah.
You know that term. Well, it's a classic case of Monday morning quarterbacking, because many very, very reputable historians, several of whom I knew very well, absolutely ripped into Bradley and Ike for the fact that they committed 3 divisions and an entire corps, and ultimately an army, because 9th Army took over the Brittany Theater under Simpson around September 1st, when Brest was never used. And I devote an entire chapter in my book on Brittany to discuss why that argument is full of holes. I mean, some of these writers say it was, a great, and it was a huge embarrassment for the Allies. But to reiterate what I was saying in the beginning of this talk, Brest was one of the essential pillars of Overlord.
Yep.
I mean, Morgan said, this port should be in our hands, according to phase lines, by roughly the first week of August. And then knowing what the Germans are probably going to do to wreck the harbor, by late August, early September 1944, we're going to be able to ship American supplies and men directly from the United States into Brest, as we did in World War I. That was the plan. And clearly, that plan was delayed, because by August 1st, the Falaise Pocket was just beginning to develop, and Brest was a long way off. There was a breakout into Brittany in early August, and there was an erroneous report that Brest had fallen to a reconnaissance unit of the 6th Armored Division, which it had not, obviously. But bottom line, Paul, is that the need for inflow of supplies, when you look at it on a week-by-week basis in late August and early September of 1944, Brest was still essential.
Yep.
Le Havre did not fall until September 12th.
Yep.
And then, knowing the way the Germans operated, you kind of had to leave another month before you could use the port because of the destruction. Now, Antwerp fell on September 4th, which was a magnificent accomplishment, but we all know that due to the Scheldt estuary not being cleared, in which I think, what was it that Admiral Cunningham said? He said, yes, Antwerp has fallen, but it is much use to us now as an oasis in the Sahara Desert, he said. And he said, anyway, Antwerp would not be of use until mid-November. Marseille was liberated around end of August, but that was even more distant from the front than Brest was.
Yeah.
So it was very clear when you read Eisenhower's directives, which he pretty much released the directive every week. And in early September, number 1 priority, capture Brest. Mid-September, capture Brest. Even at the fall of Brest, he's saying, it's essential that we put this port into use. As I said, Le Havre had only just been captured. We were beginning to understand that the bad weather was going to start disrupting the flow of supplies over the beaches. Antwerp was going to be a long way off. The channel ports, which were quite small, were, for the most part, held by the enemy. So when you look at this in retrospect from the basis of what the generals knew and when they knew it, everything about the Brest campaign actually makes sense.
Yeah.
Because had Patton, I'm not blaming Patton for anything, But had Patton been able to commit, or somebody been able to commit supplies to Middleton that were needed right from the word go, and had Brest fallen on August 31st, it would have been put into use. It was only the changing situation on the front that by end of September, Eisenhower finally concluded, well, I'm going to count on Antwerp being useful by October. And if all else fails, we have Marseille and we have Le Havre, but, I think we can forego Brest. And this argument that it was a useless exercise and waste of lives was very, very hurtful to the veterans who committed to the campaign. Everyone, the 29th Division lost 700 dead. And then many are buried in the St. James Cemetery. And, that argument that it was all a grotesque embarrassment was very hurtful to the men who experienced this, because they gave everything to this campaign. And I argue very, very vociferously in my book that Brest has to be re-examined because of what we knew and when we knew it. And, the argument of saying, we should have known not to go there when we had no idea what was going to happen in the next couple of months. So anyway,
but to touch on the historiography and the way Brest has been written, but we had a question much earlier from Sheldrake. Does Patton's lack of interest in Brittany get translated into post-war interpretations of this campaign? Because, I'm writing about the American 8th Corps under Middleton earlier in the campaign, when it was the 82nd and the 79th and the 90th. But Middleton, for example, didn't leave a post-war memoir. Gerhardt, was a difficult character. So Patton, for post-war historians, was always, great quotations, great. He was controversial. He was always spicy. So do you think Patton's feelings about the Brittany campaign were very influential in the way the historians wrote about it?
That's a totally great question, because the answer is yes.
Yes, I knew you were going to say that.
Patton drew all of this, attention, which was quite unfair. Middleton was the man on the scene, and two people like Middleton and Patton were about as different as two human beings could be. Middleton was a studious, bespectacled, spectacled guy, and he famously said something that Patton would have practically vomited about. They said to Middleton in his early days, "Why don't you join the cavalry?" And he said, "I hate horses." And that type of statement would be really obnoxious to people like Gerhardt and Patton. Patton understood that the glory headlines were going to be in the race across France, as they should have been. But, he also should have understood that ultimately there was no way that drive across Northwest Europe could be sustained forever. And consequently, the question by your listener is really on the mark. The interpretation of Brest was influenced by people like Patton, because he had no interest in Brest.
Yeah. Well, Sheldrake is a general, so he does know what he's talking about. But in terms of the Brittany campaign, one of the things you were talking about earlier is the lessons learned. And one of the things that I think is particularly interesting about it is it's one of the real times urban warfare comes in, not just in Brest, but in Saint Malo, for the other units as well in that area. That Normandy, Saint Malo, I guess, is an urban environment. It wasn't really urban warfare. The fighting was done in the hedgerows and the ridges before Saint Malo, and the same would apply to Caen. Not much fighting in Caen. It was all the high ground beyond. The urban warfare of taking out these ports, that was going to be influential later on when the units like the 29th get into Germany, when you do have major civil in population centers to take on. So were there key lessons learned in the Brittany campaign to kind of start paving the way for urban warfare?
Not so much in the case of the 29th Division. In the case of the two other divisions at Brest, the 2nd and the 8th, that did much more street fighting than the 29th did. By the time the 29th neared the city walls, it was merely a matter of they actually went under the city walls to get into the city. And by the time they got into the city per se, pretty much the battle was over. The other two divisions, yes. It wasn't really until Aachen when the 116th Infantry had been loaned to the 30th Division to fight in the battle for Aachen, that street fighting became an integral element of what the division had to do. And then in Ulick again.
Yeah.
But no, unfortunately, I should say fortunately, the 29th didn't have to really do much of that at Brest. Yeah.
And the other thing I want to ask about is, I kind of just hinted at it there, that from July to August, there is this reshuffling of the packs. Corps get assigned to different armies, divisions get moved out of and into corps, units get attached to corps, then they get attached to other corps, artillery units, tank destroyer units. I mean, obviously, the needs at the time were that units were being shifted around to where they were needed. But, as a military historian, is that always a wise tactic, rearranging things when you start to get to know, do corps have ways of fighting, or is it divisions that have ways of fighting? What's your take on that kind of shuffling about period? Because it's not something the British and Canadians did particularly. It was a more American thing where you go, okay, this division's going off to another corps, sometimes in a different army.
Yes, in the American Army, really the high-level doctrine is that corps are headquarters, and that's it. They're headquarters that are geared not to supply, not to logistics. They're geared to one thing. Their staff is oriented to fighting. When you worry about supply, you go up to Army. So it was almost part of the equation that when you were a corps commander, you had to understand that you were going to be rotating divisions as the situation demanded. And sometimes the situation would be stable and sometimes it wouldn't. And after Brest, it was very unstable, as you pointed out. It was really the division that was the integral, focus on the battle, and I'll go wherever I'm needed. But, in the case of the 29th Division, they fought under 8th Corps in Brittany, and then ended up going into 19th Corps, and then pretty much do all the rest of the fighting in 19th Corps, except in the race across Germany when they bounced around from corps to corps exactly as you described. And, I think that's the way the American Army wanted it. They wanted to have these corps commanders say, give me something when I need it.
And I agree with what you say about the division being the primary kind of tool there, but it was interesting when you said earlier about the use of tank destroyers, because that, I'm writing about Middleton and the 8th Corps up in La Haye-de-Puy, and he loves his tank destroyers up there. There are independent tank destroyer units coming down towards La Haye-de-Puy and Lessay doing that kind of improvised role of artillery. They're kind of busting hedgerows. He's using mortars, chemical mortars. Do you think some of Middleton's influence of what the divisions he'd had under his command in July, he's able to kind of put that advice to the 29th, or is someone like Gerhardt too Gerhardty to kind of take advice on from a corps command, just carried on doing things the 29th Division way?
Exactly. It was that. Gerhardt and Middleton had a very frosty relationship. Gerhardt was, should I say, juvenile about the whole thing. He did not admire Middleton, and yet Middleton was a much more brainy general. Middleton was one who had a much broader view of the war as a whole. And I'm curious, Paul, if you're doing some stuff on Middleton and Normandy, what do you think about Middleton?
Well, it's difficult because he didn't say much about himself. So you have to work on what other people say about him, and not a lot of this correspondence survives. And when he was at one of the universities in Louisiana after the war, he was kind of involved in some things that we would consider kind of racist these days. So his archives he wasn't very keen on having African-American students, shall we say. And so a lot of his stuff isn't really available, but it seems that the people below him, James Gavin respected him, seemed to get on quite well with them. The 90th are changing commanders too frequently to kind of get a sense of what they think of Middleton. But I think Middleton is pretty damn good without being brilliant. That 7 out of 10 that I think is probably enough to be a corps commander. I think if you're a 10 out of 10, it means on some days you're probably a 2 out of 10. It's like in football or soccer, the players that will give you a brilliant performance one game will also give you a crap performance two that game. It's your consistent 7 out of 10s who win you competitions. And for me, Middleton is like a consistent 7 out of 10 person. I don't know whether you agree or disagree with that, but that's kind of where I am right now.
No, I agree. He was the youngest regimental commander in the American Expeditionary Force in World War One. And, to show you how, unlike Earhart and Patton, the common soldier respected him, the great cartoonist Bill Malden, who was a member of the 45th Infantry Division, wrote a Willie and Joe cartoon and dedicated it, signed it for Troy Middleton, saying, with great respect from your dog faces. And you know what? For Bill Malden, who despised Patton later in the war, for Bill Malden to say that, that he had the respect of the common man.
He really was a soldier's general, and Bradley kind of earned that moniker, or gave it himself, of being the soldier's general. I don't know that Bradley really is suited to that. I think Bradley could be a bit vindictive and a bit hold grudges, and don't think he really cared. I mean, I'm not saying he didn't care about the men below him, but I don't think he had that genuine kind of connection that someone like Middleton did, and some other commanders I can kind of think of later on. But we're going down a general understanding. I want to bring a couple of questions.
Sure.
August asked earlier about the approach to Brest. So going back to 29th, does Joe believe the geography approaching Brest hindered the 29th with the sloping ground down towards Brest and the two peninsulas that protected the port? I mean, you've kind of covered that earlier on, but as you said earlier, the Germans know which way you're going to go. There's no flat outflanking possible. You can't, they can have all those approaches covered. As you say, the coastal batteries had 360-degree fire. The geography didn't lend itself to doing much beyond just slogging it out, I guess.
Totally true. I mean, the predominant sentiment from the veterans, and I accompanied a very large group of 29th Division veterans to Brittany in the 90s. The predominant terrain feature that just affected the entire tactical nature of the operation was the hedgerow again.
Yeah.
And having walked these hedgerows, very little different from those in Normandy.
Yeah.
There really wasn't much to do. There were a couple of hills here and there, famous Hill 103, which was captured by the 175th Infantry in late August. That made a difference because you can kind of see into Brest from Hill 103. But other than that, no, the terrain was just, claustrophobic, and there was no subtlety. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. So as we kind of get towards the end of this, anything else you feel you want to say that is a vital either lesson the 29th learned, or something that you feel historians have overlooked, or I mean, we've covered some of that ground already, but anything else you feel that is integral to understand the 29th's role in this campaign?
I just will reiterate the pioneering nature of some of the things the 29th Division and the other divisions at Brest accomplished in this campaign. The use of air power, totally revolutionary. The ability to adapt with very limited supply, and the beginning of the concept that young men thrown into the front from replacement depots have to be treated more humanely. I mean, that to me are the lessons that come out of this. And the division emerged from this campaign very proud of they did the job. It was only after this Monday morning quarterbacking started to happen that they said, boy, we did the job, and everybody says we didn't need to do the job. So, I mean, it'll come, that's how I'll summarize it.
Well, thank you for that. My last question is that we've talked a lot about the units that came in after D-Day. So the units like, I don't know, the 83rd Division, for example, or the British 49th Division that weren't there on June the 6th. But the 29th absolutely were there on June the 6th, and some, we all know about the casualties on Omaha Beach. But that meant that in your work as a historian, your work bringing tour groups over, working with the media, how did the Veterans Union feel about the fact that media would be interested in June the 6th and Normandy, and maybe as far as Saint Malo, but as far as the general media is concerned, they're not interested in Brest, they're not interested in crossing the Rhine? And so did veterans who weren't part of that initial spearhead feel that their role was overlooked, or did they not feel worthy of being able to talk? Because I'm assuming a lot of the veterans that you took on tours hadn't been involved in June the 6th because of the turnover.
Many. That's a really significant question in my life, because I did not intend to write a second book after I wrote Beyond the Beachhead. I meant that book to be a standalone book. And that book gained a lot of attention because it opened up people's eyes about the Normandy campaign and the role and the trials and tribulations of the common soldier. But I actually had a couple of confrontations with 29 veterans who were not even in Normandy. And they said, you told a great story here, but there's a better story if you go on. And, I said, no, I'm not going on. And there was a person who developed into a very good friend of mine at 29th Division reunions. Of all things, he was a Catholic priest. He served in the 115th Infantry during the war, not as a priest, went into the priesthood later. And he said, you really have to take the story to the end of the war. And, he made me feel guilty. And, I said, you're right. I'm going to do that. And I wrote 4 more books. And the story was just as interesting after Normandy as it was in Beyond the Beachhead. And, of course, not as many people read it, but it doesn't matter to me. I mean, taking the story all the way to the Elbe River, and you cover every single veteran's experience, even if he came in as a replacement in March of 45. To me, he was right. I did need to tell the other story, and I didn't make much money doing it, but I did it.
No, well, thank you for that. And I think it's, with what was happening in Normandy this June, that the people like the Best Defense Foundation bringing veterans back, very few of the veterans they brought were first wave D-Day. Very few were D-Day. Only a handful were Normandy. They were veterans from all campaigns, all eras, because they're the last men standing. And I like the fact that this year, the public in Normandy didn't really care whether or not the person had stormed the beach on D-Day or been part of the attack on somewhere like Brest or Aachen or somewhere else. They just appreciated the fact that they were one of the big team, and that big team of, as you said there, the millions that there were, frankly, fighting the Allied effort by World War II, and they all are part of it. And we're all a bit guilty of that, of kind of D-Day blindness, as we are like market garden blindness, because that's what the media talks about. That's where the films are set. That's where the video games are set. But you're helping to explain and shed light on the Brittany campaign has been really fantastic. So, Joe, we will leave it there, but we will bring you back again to talk about the winter of 44, 45, and then into spring next year as we still keep covering these 80th anniversaries. Tomorrow, folks, Ronan is coming on to talk more about the defenses of Brest, and he'll do another presentation later on about the 2nd Division, who, as you saw on the map earlier, were just around to the east of the 29th, and we'll do that later on. Joe, it's been great talking to you, my friend. I treasure my signed copies of your books, and every tour guide in Normandy who owes a debt to you, but not only for Beyond the Beachhead, but Omaha Beach, which is the fact us guides call that the Bible, is to your credit, sir.
Thank you.
Thank
I appreciate that.
So thank you very much, folks. I'll be here again tomorrow. So thanks for your fantastic questions and comments. We'll see you all again tomorrow. This is Paul Woodage for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Bye.